Hello, and welcome to the Global Journalism Seminar Series at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I'm Caitlin Mercer, and I'm joined this week by Hamza Syed, co-host of the New York Times and serial podcast production, The Trojan Horse Affair. The podcast follows Hamza, at the time studying journalism at De Montfort University in Leicester, and podcasting veteran Brian Reed of S-Town fame, as they search for the author of a 2013 letter that alleged there was an Islamist plot to take over Birmingham schools. The letter was used by then Education Secretary Michael Gove, despite being told by Birmingham City Council that its credibility was in doubt, to extend counterterrorism strategy PREVENT in schools. That should be the headline takeaway from this podcast, but it hasn't been. Because it was a podcast investigation that cast Hamza in a protagonist role, as a character grappling with the role of journalism, who he wanted to be as a journalist, how his faith fitted into that equation, and what objectivity means. If you've joined us today hoping for a gotcha takedown of a young journalist, you'll be disappointed. And I'll explain why later, but for me, this podcast triggered a lot of reflection. I could identify with the mistakes Hamza made. I knew what backlash was coming for him, and I was not surprised by the criticism. But for a first story, a first investigation that took over 2 years, yielded 1,000 hours of tape, was fact-checked by a team of 7 editors and 5 lawyers in the US and the UK, and the New York Times Standards Division. It is a remarkable piece of work. Maybe he didn't get to the bottom of the Parkview School scandal or trigger any new inquiries, but he definitely made a lot of people think about journalism, British journalism, podcast investigations, and the limits of objectivity. And for that reason, I'm so pleased to welcome you, Hamza, and continue this conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start out with a nice softball. Why did you decide to study journalism after qualifying as a doctor? And where did you go to study it?
A sequence of bad decisions. It wasn't quite as direct as going from medicine to journalism. I graduated from medical school and I had this vague notion of wanting to be a writer. That's kind of what I was pursuing, but it had no definition beyond that point for a while. So I was just, I settled on comedy writing for television for a bit, actually, because a script of mine did really well in this competition and the BBC optioned it. And I thought, okay, here we go. That's kind of where I'm headed. And I spent God knows how many years just a struggling TV writer, not getting any of my stuff kind of made or even read that often. And I'd given myself this hard cutout at 30. I was like, the second I hit 30, I am going to stop this and do something else. And I hit 30. And actually, it was this really weird thing. The second I crossed 30, at that point, I was working on a drama about terrorism. About it was just kind of this fictional piece about this British guy who basically gets radicalized and ends up going to Syria. And so there's a bunch of accounts I was following on Twitter at the time who were academics who'd done a bunch of research about radicalization. And one of them tweeted out randomly about this investigative journalism master's that's about to start at De Montfort University that Channel 4 were sponsoring. And I just thought, well, I've hit my 30 and here's what appears to be a clue for what I could possibly pivot to, still be writing, but in a way that might be useful to people. And so I applied for that master's and here we are.
Yeah. And just before starting that program, you cornered Brian Reed in his dressing room in 2019.
The night before, yeah. So we're supposed to turn up to the course with a story that we're going to investigate as a student project, and I'd settled on the Trojan Horse. And I talked about it with my professor. I talked about it with a few other people, and it was such a notorious case. The Trojan Horse is something that was very widely covered by a lot of experienced reporters, and so I felt like I'm not sure what you're trying to introduce here to this narrative, and the idea that the entire thing might have been, bullshit was hard to put across to people. So Brian was traveling through, he was passing passing through my city, doing a talk for S-Town, this big podcast that he just put out. And I was a big fan of the way they did stories here. So I thought, yeah, let's see if I can get him to listen to the story and help me out a little, you know?
What were you imagining was going to happen at that point?
The intention was clear. I just wanted to get in front of a journalist and essentially just rattle through the beats of the story. This is the Trojan Horse, as people understand it. And then I just needed some direction of who to speak to first. I was really paranoid about messing up this investigation and going about it in a totally wrong way. I've never done this before. It felt like a serious case. So that's all I really wanted. I just want someone to hear me out, but hear me out from, like, you know, the first time they're confronting the story. And then advise me. Like, my main question was, should I go to Adley Primary School essentially tomorrow and try to speak to people there? Should I go to the council? Should I go to the DFE? Where do I begin? But before I even got to that, he'd already kind of jumped in and said he really liked the story, and he might want to look into this with me. And yeah, you know, next thing you know, he was jumping in on my project and taking over.
Roll tape. So now you've studied but not worked in a UK newsroom. Is that fair to say? And you've had this baptism of fire in the biggest newsroom in the US, possibly the world. My question is, what differences have you noticed between US and UK journalism?
On like a very like superficial level, just confidence, to be honest. Like, I don't, people aren't afraid to do certain stories here. And I'm not saying it's like a reflection of the culture of the two countries. I think it's a reflection of the laws of the two countries, as far as journalism is concerned. It's not as protected in Britain. And that means every story, as much as being kind of like, from my experience anyway, as much as being considered on the merits of the story, it's also at the same time being thought through as the viability of it, you know? Are we going to be able to tell the story? Are we going to get in trouble? Like, what information are we going to be able to gather? And I think Brian was new to journalism in Britain, so I don't think he'd quite like considered what it would entail doing an investigative series in England. So I think like a good reflection of the difference between the two countries is Brian's experience in the Trojan Horse Affair. Like, the stuff that he's getting upset about, the stuff that he's getting frustrated by, that's because he doesn't expect that. He doesn't expect a journalist to have to suffer in that way.
Give us an example of where Brian was getting really frustrated.
I mean,
thinking of the FOIs.
Every day, FOIs were a nightmare. Not just in terms of like, listen, like, no government just willingly gives up information that's likely going to lead to something, but there's at least a bit of a process in place in America that makes it more sense. In England, you put in an FOI, and it seems to be that a well-established game amongst the government or officials is to time you out. Like, they can take 18 months to release you information that you have a right to, that you'll ultimately get, but it will take you 18 months. And not everyone has that time. So I think it's just clear the way the frivolous rejections that you get for FOIs. So that was a problem. People just not willing to speak was new to him, and concerned by what it would mean legally, you know, defamation, injunctions, all these terms were coming up that he doesn't usually have to deal with on a daily basis. I remember one of the biggest issues we had was trying to get any information related to that Adderley case, which is a very important central kind of, you know, a part of the story. And we couldn't even get like a straight answer about where to get the reasoned judgment, you know, which is just the document that's the judge has summarized the case and published it, and it should be available publicly. But even that is hard to get a hold of in Britain. And then the court files that were like, we have them, we don't have them, they've been destroyed, they should have been destroyed. Like, you know, in America, you could just walk into a courtroom and just, you know, fill in a form, and they give you all the evidence base, all the every document that's associated with that. So it's just the right to access to information is very different in the two countries, and I think that reflects in the journalism that you get.
I wanted to play a clip from episode 6. And in this episode, you've written a letter requesting an interview. And it's a letter that all of us have written at some point. We've all been there and done that. Where you're kind of really appealing to the guy, saying you never believed a single thing about the Trojan Horse scandal. Ouch. And then you kind of invoke your religion to get the guy to speak to you brother to brother. I'm sorry, I know it's your least favorite phrase now.
Take me right back to the West.
How did your stomach drop when you realized he'd sent the letters to Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I was in shock. I remember telling Brian afterwards. Yeah, I knew I was on the phone to someone and they were talking, but I couldn't tell you what he was saying. I was just in my head, just was whirling. But yeah, you can play the tape.
So he takes the letters, he sends them to Brian Reed, and he tells him that you're using him. And I want to play this kind of internal dialogue that Brian has near the end of that episode, and just wave at me if it's not working correctly.
If I think back to the reasons I got into journalism, if you asked me back then why I was drawn to it, I would have told you I like stories. I want to learn the craft. I'm interested in people. I do distrust authority. I want to hold them accountable. Making a change in the world would have been in there, but not at the top of the list. But Hamza has been clear from the get-go about his reason for getting into this work. In fact, aside from that unfortunate paragraph in his letter to Aslam, in which Hamza lists all the people he never believed, most of what he wrote in that letter amounts to a moving mission statement. If you believe journalism is an evil organ capable of causing great damage, Hamza wrote, then by default, you believe that same organ can reach as many people to cause great change. That's the concept I've decided to dedicate my life to. He would pursue this work, he wrote, as a Muslim first and foremost, and as a journalist second.
I mean, imagine writing that to a source, huh?
I can imagine writing that to a source. But I put down my phone at that point, and I started having a very, very, very long debate with myself, because I was with you up until that point, even with the letters. I've done that. But when you said as a Muslim first and foremost and as a journalist second, I was so uncomfortable with that statement, and I had to kind of stop and go, okay, why are you so uncomfortable with that statement? Is this Islamophobia? And I don't think so. I lived in the Arab Emirates for nearly a decade in the early 2000s. So I had that massive awakening of what a shite job the Western media does of covering the region and the nuances of both the Arab region and Islam. But I am someone who came out of big religion, and so I guess I'm very cautious about any ideology that doesn't evolve and take in new information. Any ideology that resists changing or evolving under the guise of the preservation of tradition. And as I was kind of arguing with myself about, oh, it's not good to have this ideology in front of journalism, it kind of clicked in my head, journalism is an ideology. And it's one that should evolve and take in new information, and it's one that refuses to evolve under the guise of tradition. So should I don't really get to sit there and go, you must list your ideologies in this order, please. And the thing that you're bucking against throughout this podcast, the kind of concept of objectivity, is kind of holy to us. And I'm still struggling with the idea from a lot of young journalists that we need to throw it out because it's entirely impossible for anyone to be impartial. But here's the question. Does it mean that we shouldn't be aiming to be impartial, at least?
Yeah. Where I stand on this is that, and I don't know if this is right or wrong. This is just where I am at the
No,
moment.
that's
Is
I don't know if I'm right or wrong either to
yeah,
have in
like
the air.
I think if journalism concerned itself with the truth above all else, if
Mm,
that's what every reporter, when they're embarking on a story, if that's what they were looking to find,
mm,
and by the truth I mean find evidence to be able to support what you're saying, not just
mm,
an opinion.
mm,
I find objectivity or impartiality is your fallback plan. It's
mm,
if you fall short from gathering enough evidence to be able to tell me definitively what happened, then yes, go and gather all the different perspectives on it, all the different possibilities, and settle for that. But don't aspire for that. And I find most journalism aspires for that, as opposed to going further to try to establish what the truth is. It's about, let's get an assortment of opinions about what might have happened. And so I've never kind of put objectivity as my end game, as like, this is what I believe is a perfect piece of reporting. No, a perfect piece is evidence to be able to say definitively what happened. And that's kind of what I pursue. And then if I don't get that, I fall back on, well, here's one person's take and here's another person's take, you know? In that moment, one of my biggest fears, paranoias, and if you want, we could get into where that came from, was I knew from day one, I'm a Muslim person, and I'm reporting on a story that involves Muslims in Birmingham. This is very close to home.
mm,
And from day one, I'm just imagining what that means for my journalism, what that means for my credibility. Will people believe me just because I'm so close to the event?
mm,
And for a long time in this investigation, I was just constantly obstructing myself, obstructing my instincts, obstructing my thoughts and my responses to people, because I just wanted to just disappear. I wanted to be in the background. You don't even notice me. Here's me with a microphone, and to speak into this microphone and unchecked, as far as I was concerned, because I did not want to get in the way. I don't want to be accused of directing someone in some kind of way, or even like looking for specific answers from people. Um, and I twisted myself up in that to such an extent that I thought I was practically useless in rooms. Um, I had no idea what I was doing there, apart from sat opposite people who, for 2 hours, I knew were talking nonsense, and I was just allowing that to happen because I didn't want to get in the way of their narrative. But if their narrative doesn't make any sense, and if I have evidence to challenge that narrative, why am I sat here for 2 hours, and why am I being shy about it by letting them know that I don't believe you, and here's why? And when the Aslam letter surfaced, it was, I knew it was kind of game over in some sense. I was like, well, what are you going to hide now? You know what I mean? This is who you are, and it's out there. And so I just prioritized who I am above
mm,
what I was doing, and
mm,
wasn't shy about just making that clear. So when I say, you know, I'm Muslim first and reporter second, it's because that's how I believe people perceive me anyway. And
mm,
so might as well live it. And at least that means I'll be more functional, and hopefully more useful at doing my work, because I'm not constantly just cutting myself down, you know?
mhm.
Um,
So it
so
sounds
yeah,
like it was kind of freeing in a sense.
well, yeah, it was liberating. I remember we had a conversation about it at one point. We had this big 2 hour debate about journalism, which was recorded actually. It never made it into the podcast, and God knows what we'll do with that tape
Take it.
in the
I'll take it.
future.
I'll take it.
Yeah, it was at the height of my disillusionment with journalism, and
Mm,
we were in New York, and I was just schlepping about for weeks, and Brian was like, okay, you clearly have something on your mind. Why don't we just jump in the studio and let's just talk? And we had this 2 hour just debate about journalism and the
mm,
story and what it was doing. And as part of that, it was I came to the realization that like that letter was so liberating for me, and whatever I've managed to achieve with the Trojan Horse is because of that letter. It's
mm,
because beyond that point, I just knew what I was and what I was doing, and
mm,
before that I was so confused, and I don't know what impact I would have had on the journalism, and I don't know where the story would have got to if I had remained in
mm,
that state. But what you hear is a product of me switching, and you know, just deciding that like this is who I am, but here's all the evidence. And if you can get past who I am and, you know, confront the evidence, I think we're going to be all right. But yeah, it's a bit of a complicated moment. It took a few years to come to terms with it.
Did that 2-hour conversation help your disillusionment with journalism? How are you feeling now?
I mean, by the end of it, I was pretty much, I had like unofficially given in my notice, you know what I mean? To just be like, I'm doing this story. At that point, we still had years of writing ahead of us. So it wasn't a place for me to check out completely. But it was a marker of just like, I'm here to finish this project and I'm here to write this series. But beyond that, I'm gone. And that's kind of, you know, that 2-hour conversation. It wasn't just Brian and I remember Sarah Koenig got ready to get involved, and it became like a whole conversation. You know, it'll be leaked someday, I'm sure. But yeah, it helped me just realize that I can't do this. Like, I need to step away.
Yeah. Well, listen, Brian and Sarah, if you're listening, we're very happy to host that content for you, whoever the leaker might be. How are you feeling about the reaction in the UK press?
Terrible. I mean, I'm quite predictable, to be honest.
Did you know? Was it predictable to you? Did you know that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, if you listen to episode 8, and I haven't heard the podcast since before it came out. So just that bit of tape that you played me is the first time I've heard that in many, many months. But from what I remember, there is a piece of script in episode 8 that I was determined to kind of leave in there, which was just foreshadowing what's going to happen when the series comes out. And it's not hopeful, you know, it's not expecting great change. So yeah, it's that predictable. In fact, it's so predictable that at one point I remember writing headlines before the series came out saying this is what we're going to expect, and even predicting sources. They're going to go speak to this person, and that's the kind of article that's going to come out. And if I were to publish that now, you'd think I'm like some psychic or something like that. It's almost verbatim what happened. Like, that's how predictable it is, which is, you know, it's depressing, it's embarrassing. Like, you know, it'd be nice for British journalism to surprise you now and again. But no, I wasn't shocked by what happened. I totally expected it.
Do you understand the criticism that actually those school investigations did unearth some serious problems, like the homophobia and the child endangerment, the women's rights stuff?
To a certain extent, I think I would love someone to explain to me why Parkview or any of the schools in East Birmingham, for that matter, are different to general schools in England, the issues you'd confront in any school in England. I would love someone to explain to me that, because what I find shocking actually is we lay out in episode 6 all the various issues, concerns, factual errors that are embedded in that official report of the Trojan Horse. For people to continue to pluck allegations from that report and say, well, what about this? What about that? We're trying to say that, like, hey, listen, everything merits investigation, everything merits scrutiny, but you're still verbatim just taking allegations that you have not gone on to find out if that's the truth or not. You know, the stuff that we focused on, the most concerning allegations to come out of Parkview, well, you know what happened with half of those allegations. You know what became the truth of those. I'm not saying there wasn't things happening at Parkview that were terrible. I think as all schools in England, terrible things happen. Whereas other schools, there's a context brought in. For example, there was a story that came out, I think, a month or so ago in Britain. Someone can jump in with the details because I'm kind of hazy on it, but it involved a young girl, she was 14, who got strip searched, I believe, by the police in a school in London somewhere.
Yeah.
Nobody saw that as a reflection of school policy. That's not how it was reported, or something that everyone in the school agreed with or consented to or happens regularly. It was a shocking event, dealt with as a shocking event, as some kind of singular failure in some sense. And, you know, the people responsible are the police, the teacher who referred the child or whatever, you know, it was contained within the characters who were involved in that specific event. But I didn't hear an argument or a take that this is reflection of a school policy, or this is how that school operates with all young girls. They all just get randomly strip searched now and again by the police. Like, that's not what the argument was being made about that school.
Right. So if
Whereas
only that school weren't so secular, that wasn't an argument.
Exactly. Now, if that happened in East Birmingham in 2014, that a young girl was strip searched by the police, that would have been reported in a very different way. That would have been seen as a reflection of like how women are treated at the school, these men who are in charge of these schools. This would have been talked about as if it's like a school policy, as a regular occurrence. So what I'm trying to say is, were there isolated incidents at Parkview School and other schools in East Birmingham and schools everywhere in Britain where things go wrong? Absolutely. But with the Trojan Horse, that's not how any of that was discussed. Every incident, whether verified or not, was seen as a reflection of some wider ideology, as a commentary on the faith that these people practice, the culture, the background. And that's where I take issue with the Trojan Horse. Concerns, yes. Wider than that, I'm not sure. And I still would love to see some evidence that would support that.
Do you think you should have spent longer addressing these concerns so people understood that you understand how important they are?
I think someone would have to, again, to each their own in terms of the ratio they would give these incidents in a story. I would point out that our podcast is 8 episodes long, 8 hours. We spent 2 episodes, so that's 2 hours of the series speaking to these events at Parkview School, speaking to these allegations at Parkview School, hearing from teachers at the school directly, dealing with the evidence, the official accounts, and following up on that with the people who accuse or alleges. That's 2 hours of an 8-hour podcast. Trojan Horse was, a substantive case, loads of events, loads of different storylines. If you're telling me that we should have given it 3 hours, 4 hours, half the series should have been spent on those allegations, then I disagree, but to each their own in terms of where they draw the line. We thought those issues were well covered by giving them 2 episodes in a 8-episode series, but to each their own.
Okay. It's 25%.
Yeah,
what would justice have looked like to you? What were you hoping to achieve?
I mean, if the Trojan Horse came out in a functional democracy, here's what I would have expected, at the very least, I imagine. One of our biggest discoveries involves this audit report, which was very important to a specific event connected to the Trojan Horse. And we discover that there is a big timeline issue with some of the details in this report that has huge consequences for the understanding of what happened at that school and possibly what happened with the Trojan Horse Affair. At the very least, I would have expected the local police, who had a fraud investigation into that case running at the time, for whom that detail that we've now discovered is crucial. It possibly suggests a misdirection of the investigation. At the very least, I would expect the police to have reopened that fraud investigation, considered this detail of ours, and seen how that fits in with what they understand happened at that school. Likewise, the Birmingham City Council, who were responsible for that audit report and retracted it off the back of this detail that Brian and I zeroed in on. I would expected them to have confronted that detail, imagined what that meant for their audit report, reevaluated what they thought about what happened at Adley Primary School and the Trojan Horse Affair. I would have expected someone, whether it's government, whether it's any reporter in any publication anywhere, to have asked Michael Gove why he knowingly used a piece of misinformation to drive hysteria in the country and change our laws, or help with the changing of our laws. Like, that's such a foundational question that I think, like, I'm shocked nobody thinks that's important enough to ask him. Like, take the wallpaper out of it, just take that detail. A government minister used a piece of misinformation to mislead the public and help drive draconian changes to our laws, and nobody cares. So at the very least, I would have expected some follow with Michael Gove about why he chose to ignore that briefing. And then, maybe I'm dreaming here, but I would have expected newsrooms in the country to look at the way they reported on the Trojan Horse and see if there's anything that they think they could do differently next time. if there's anything they need to put in place to make sure they don't, go off on a tangent again. That for me was just basic, and I think if the Trojan Horse came out in a country that worked, that would have happened. And if you look at what has happened, nothing. When I say nothing, I mean as basic as, we talked about this, like Adley Primary School is featured quite heavily in the series. Even if you're going to write a hit piece on us, even if you're going to write this dangerous person from Birmingham has done this terrible podcast, don't listen to it, the New York Times, blah, 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 etc., whatever. Wouldn't you just, like be incumbent on you to call the school, even for a comment? I'm not even saying like call them to be like, what do you make of these allegations? Just to be like, hey, what do you, do you want to contribute a quote to this piece that we're writing to say that these guys are deranged and idiots or whatever? To that extent, there's been no follow-up. Like no one has been curious enough to even call the school to say that, like, hey, there's plenty said about what happened there in 2012. Like, do you have anything to say back? I'm not saying it would have been the most substantive conversation, but I haven't even seen like the school denied our request for an interview. I haven't even seen that line anywhere yet. Sure. That's how little follow-up has happened. So,
I mean, I do think it is a very fair criticism to say there's been a lot of coverage, but it's been 80% op-ed.
Well, that's the thing. See, what I mean, I'm not saying it confused me because I could see how that happened, but so much of what's been written about us has either been opinion pieces, commentary pieces, or arts and culture critics reviewing it as a piece of entertainment. How many news articles have followed up from the Trojan Horse Affair? I think one, maybe The Guardian, the Michael Gove thing.
Birmingham Live did some interesting reporting, but I think
Birmingham
really
Live did the most interesting. Here's Birmingham Live. They actually had an opportunity to ask Michael Gove a question because he was passing through Birmingham at the time this podcast came out, and their reporter decided to ask Michael Gove, what do you make of the podcast, essentially?
Yeah.
Now, what do you think that, what is that question going to yield? Why don't you ask Michael Gove why he knowingly used a bogus letter to whip up a frenzy? Like, it's basic, but that's where they decided to use that opportunity to ask him, what do you make of the podcast? And I think he said something about a shoddy piece of journalism, et cetera. Yeah. Excellent.
I'll say that something I found particularly strange was when I was reading all the articles, trying to prepare for this, I just wanted to find what university you'd been to. Such a simple thing. What university did you do your master's at? Not a single article of the thousands bothered to do that tiny piece of journalism. Like, oh, let's find out where this guy studied. Let's ask his professor for a comment. I mean, yeah. So
that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know what it betrays. Either it just betrays that disinterest, either it betrays laziness, either I don't know what it betrays. But it's not journalism. You know what I mean? Like, again, like it would have been great if people would have engaged with this, if news reporters had engaged with this story.
Yeah.
But it's almost, I don't know, it's almost by design, because then if you engage with this as a news reporter, you have to deal with the discoveries of the podcast. You have to deal with the news in the podcast, and Britain just wasn't interested in that. Like, Britain would rather just deal with, I don't know, just like frivolous issues, you know what I mean? Like, just distractions. It's the phenomenon of 2014 just repeated itself again when the podcast came out. And,
Would you do anything differently?
Yeah, we've talked about that a lot. Like, I think, here's my take on it. We put out an 8-hour podcast in a country that is still catching up to the tradition of investigative journalism in the podcast medium. And I think we asked a lot of people to sit for 8 hours, listen to the whole thing, take it all in, understand it, focusing on the details, issues, pull them out, and then go do some follow-ups. Like, that I think is fair. Like, you could say we don't have the time for this, or the patience for this. We should have, in my opinion, and we know this now, this isn't just my opinion, I think we're all in agreement, we should have released alongside the podcast just a summary article where we just distill the findings of the investigation.
Yeah,
there
were headlines in there. There was a series of headlines in there.
Yeah, exactly. Now, if you would have pitched us this before the podcast came out,
Mm.
would have said absolutely not, because we just worked for years on this piece and we wanted it to be, received. We didn't want anything to be, any surprises to be stolen away by an article. Like, we wanted people to listen to the podcast and appreciate the story and take it all in at the same time. But that's on us. That was the wrong call. Like, we should have been less precious about the story and more about the information. Put that out there in a format that people could just like read a quick article and pick all that up. And then if they choose to listen to the podcast, so be it. But if not, at least the information is being confronted. So yeah, that's something, we will bear in mind.
In your opinion, as somebody who was aligned with the New York Times office for a while, does the New York Times have it in for Britain, as one of the publications claimed?
I think that was a Daily Mail piece, which began with the Trojan Horse and ended up with Meghan Markle and some wider theory about the New York Times. No, the New York Times doesn't have it in for Britain. I've seen a bunch of takes actually that kind of reflect on, I think it's the same if you bring it down to a conversation like about people. Like, it's much easier for you to tell someone else what might be wrong with them rather than kind of have that self-reflection and figure out what's wrong with yourself. And I just feel like when the New York Times does pieces about Britain, Britain doesn't like it because it seems just like a foreign, kind of like country just commenting on your internal issues. But vice versa, I think like Britain probably does better reporting about America, and the New York Times probably does better reporting about Britain. You know what I mean? It's just far easier to just like talk to the issues about someone else rather than yourself. So I think, yeah, the New York Times doesn't have it in for Britain. They're just a better place to tell you what's happening in Britain than some of the people who are there.
I don't know if I necessarily entirely agree, but
Yeah.
I'll take it. Would you, if you do have questions for Hamza, you can please feel free to use the Q&A box to put questions in. And I want to just ask before we go to questions from the audience and the fellows downstairs. Is there any part of you that feels like Brian and Sarah have been doing this for a really long time, and did they know what they were doing using me as a character?
I didn't feel used as a character. I feel like Brian had I think, yeah, they're just more familiar with the medium. They know what a podcast needs, and I think one of the main things I remember when we're structuring the story, one of the main things we were trying to figure out is the Trojan Horse. It kind of goes through different layers. You have this very localized event in East Birmingham. You have the local government as a chapter, but then you have the national government as a chapter. You have the investigations, the reports, the journalism. And we were struggling to find one character amongst the people we interviewed who could carry us through the entirety of that story, because each one kind of jumps in for like 2 episodes, but then their bit's over, and then we kind of move to a different setting, different situation. And as we're staring at that kind of like structure wall, I knew where this was going because the only constant seems to be Brian and I. We're across it all. And I think with this project as well, like what was apparent is that like some of the biggest changes are happening between Brian and I. Like we meet each other as certain people, and by the end, it's undeniable we're in different places.
Yeah.
And so if you're looking at it in a way of like storytelling, like those are your characters, But even up to the point when we started writing the series, it wasn't quite as deliberate as like we're going to be, a thing in this. Like we obviously are going to be, we're narrating it, we've been investigating it, and there's always going to be an element of that, but not to the extent that you guys here in the podcast. Like I think that decision came about episode 3.
Okay.
By the time we got to episode 3, because episode 3, if you think about it, it's one interview and then about 20 minutes of Brian and I walking around talking about it, right? And that tape, the editors really liked. There's a bunch of ideas and themes that came up about the story and journalism and myself. And, you know, it was all just recorded just on a hoof. We just came out of the building and I was just pissed and, you know, I was just ranting and raving, walking around, and we had it all recorded and people heard that tape and they liked it. It's kind of hard for you to just bring that tape on and then just continue as you were, you know what I mean? That's a real thing that you're doing. And for a long time, I was advocating to just like, forget it, leave it. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want this, forget about it. We don't need this. Let's just keep focusing on the story. But it became an important element because it was kind of hard to decouple the story from that was happening, especially because the Aslam event had happened, which we had to put in the story. And again, it's a very weird scene just to suddenly jump into to be like, hey, let me tell you about this co-narrator of mine. Like, he did something. Exactly. So it just, I gave up. I realized that like, I'd made some decisions, I'd done some stuff, which meant that like I was going to be a character in this, whether I was comfortable with that or not. And because it was beneficial to the story anyway, because I think it benefited the wider conversations that the Trojan Horse was.
Creates a subplot.
I literally said I will agree to impale myself for this investigation, and you know, went for it.
Wow. Okay, I've got a question. I do see the questions in the Q&A, but I also just want to go to Shaprova downstairs from Bangladesh, who has a question for you. Yeah, we've got the room and we've got Shaprova. Take it away.
Hi, Hamza. Thank you for being here. I wanted to ask, in my experience post 9/11, mainstream Western media kind of started to put like all Muslims in one box, and there was like very little acknowledgement of like our ethnic, cultural, linguistic diversity. So like when I see a podcast from a Muslim journalist, I'm always really hopeful that it'll touch on that to some extent. So in the school that you mentioned in the Trojan Horse Affair, do you feel like they also kind of failed to really focus on the students' diversity beyond their religion? And like, do you feel there should have been a bit more space in your podcast for that? Is that something you wanted to focus on?
That's a good question. I mean, it depends on. It's funny. It depends on what official report you consult as far as Parkview is concerned. In 2012, Parkview had an Ofsted inspection. So this is a year and a half before the Trojan Horse went public. And they were given an outstanding ranking by Ofsted. Ofsted are school inspectors that go around and kind of independently kind of monitor schools and produce these reports. And they were ranked outstanding, and at that time it was a big deal. The Guardian covered it, a bunch of national press covered it because of the turnaround that happened at Parkview School, and also because they just recently changed like how Ofsted do these inspections. So the idea that the school got outstanding was made a big deal because it was like a more stringent criteria. And part of the thing which Ofsted zeroed in on was the way the school was catering to its student body and how they were allowing space for the faith, the culture of their student body, and giving them, you know, the opportunity, I guess, to express whatever their backgrounds were. That's something Ofsted like commended in their report directly. Now, if you go to 2014, post Trojan Horse, it's a very different story about what was happening in that school. But the idea that it was restrictive and only kind of like dealing with a certain subsect of Muslims or whatever. And so it's hard to know from two official reports what the reality of that school was, whether they were kind of like tunnel vision in the way they were approaching the student body, or whether they were acknowledging diversity of it, depending on, again, which official report you read. From the interviews that we did, from the students that we spoke to, from the teachers that we talked to, we didn't get some generalized allegation that Parkview School was discriminating against people who weren't, say, Mirpuri or Sunni Muslims. Like, we didn't get that from anyone who was inside the school, but yes, we did get it from others who had gone in and investigated it. So it's hard for me to say whether we should have spent more time figuring out the kind of the realities of that, because, you know, Parkview's makeup is also quite exceptional in the sense that, like, it's almost 95, 96% of the students come from that neighborhood, that background. It's not quite as like, you know, a broader student kind of cultural makeup as you would expect. It is quite homogenous. So we just relied on experience of people who were there, teachers and students, to tell us whether there was more to that. And I think whatever focus we gave it felt fair to us. But I understand what you're coming from. Like, I think it is, you know, especially with Muslims, you just kind of assume one size fits all. And, you know, like Parkview was certainly accused of that in 2014, but not so in 2012.
It probably would have been a vastly longer podcast, considering the audience, needing to explain the nuance before you got into those angles.
Yeah, I mean, what's funny also is that, like, you know, when you talk to kids at our school and teachers at our school, like, the idea that the school was kind of like front loading like Islam as like the way that they were figuring out all the school's issues and stuff, it seems to be the way people reflect on Parkview School now because of what's happened to Trojan Horse. That's not the impression that like the students had at the time, or even the teachers had at the time. Like, yes, religion was an element at the school because of the daily act of collective worship, the you know, obligatory law that exists in England. Like, every school has to provide for that. So certainly religion played a role in those parts for that hour or whatever the kids were having the assemblies. But otherwise, the reflections, otherwise it just sounds like a normal school. It just sounds like a regular school. Here's your class, here's your lunchroom, here's your playground, and go home, you know? And I don't know if like the teachers were gathered around to like specifically discuss theology and different students and what they believed and where we should. It didn't seem to be like a primary concern in that sense, because it was just functioning as a school and giving it the consideration like all schools are supposed to give it, especially in terms of their daily act of collective worship. So yeah, I don't know how many kids at Parkview School felt that their religion wasn't allowed to be expressed, because that's certainly not something that we came across. But we didn't speak to all 600 students or however many attend Parkview.
Got a question for you from Tippy from Norway.
Hi Hamza, thanks for being here. You actually answered some of my questions already, but I listened to that podcast some weeks ago, and for me, like, the idea was yours, and in my head you're more important than actually the Trojan Horse letter. Like, now that I think back of it, like, you're the kind of the main role. But did you listen to the edited, like the finished version of the podcast when the editing was done? And were you happy with it? Would you have changed something, like how you presented in the podcast or something?
Maybe that question could be paraphrased as, how involved in the edit process were you?
Oh, throughout, from the beginning right to the end. We wrote the series together. The editing process is substantial, but like ultimately we are the authors of the story, and so we kind of make decisions and like kind of gather everyone's, you know, opinions and comments and stuff, but ultimately we're executing them. So there's nothing in our podcast which I didn't okay. I sense that you're thinking about a specific moment that doesn't reflect well on me. Like, is there anything that you listened to and thought, that, you know, how did that get past him?
Is that fair, Tippy? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. There's a question I'm going to paraphrase from Guillermo in Uruguay. It says, you kind of in that podcast go right up to the line of saying who wrote the letter, and then you don't. Without getting arrested, do you want to tell us why?
I mean, simple reason, we didn't have the evidence to say definitively who wrote the letter, you know? So far from me to promote journalists giving you a conclusion without the evidence. So we didn't have the evidence, and we couldn't say definitively who wrote the letter. We have a compelling theory. We have a lot of evidence that speaks to that theory and poses some serious questions about a certain school in a certain situation. But we are reporting didn't allow us to be able to say with absolute conclusion who wrote the letter. I wish it had. That was kind of what I was gunning for.
Did anyone come forward since the release of the podcast with new information?
Yes, but like too soon for me to say whether there's anything important or not.
Okay.
I've had a bunch of interesting DMs.
Did you have any DMs from Australia?
Not from the person who you might be thinking about. I've heard nothing. I've had DMs from reporters in Australia. And, you know, I've encouraged anyone who reaches out to me to just be like, please do some follow-ups, you know, like we haven't like kept anything behind. Like what we have is in the podcast. So there's so much of this that remains left to be, you know, puzzled through. So yeah, anyone who DMs me, I'd tell them the same thing. Please go do some reporting.
Hamza's
That goes to this
DMs
room.
are open, guys.
Please go do some reporting.
I have a question for you from Robin. You're in the room. Should we take your question live? While we zoom in on Robin, let me just quickly tell you that Hilary Owens said, when Hamza was really pissed, I felt he was expressing my feelings. Thank you.
Where's that come from in the chat?
It's in the Q&A.
I see.
Robin.
Hi, Hamza. Thanks for being here. I don't want to kind of go over stuff that we've talked about already, but that kind of mistake that was episode 6, and so much was made of that, where I wonder, basically the company kind of allowed you to make that mistake. You had experienced editors. It was the first story that you'd ever worked on. You were, effectively a trainee. I know you're clearly a really smart and really capable guy to be able to do all that kind of reporting on your own. But any trainee makes mistakes like that all the time. I know it might be a bit difficult for you to comment, and I know I get the sense that Brian is a friend of yours anyway. But it seemed like they didn't take any responsibility. You know, all of the conversation was Brian calling you and saying, Hamza, you've made this terrible mistake, and you've been like, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have done that. And nothing from them about actually not very much from them about this is this guy's first story, and everybody makes these kind of mistakes in their first story, or normally they're not even, they don't even have the space to do that because everything's so there's so much oversight normally, and as an editor who's edited lots of people's first stories, I usually have a really clear eye on everything they're doing. Show me this before you send it. So it kind of just strikes me actually more of their mistake than yours, and I'd be interested to know what you think about that.
I mean, it's definitely my mistake. I don't doubt that. I think the thing also to remember about the Trojan Horse is, for a very long time, this wasn't with Serial. This wasn't with the New York Times. This was Brian at the time was working at This American Life when I approached him. And, it was basically he and I for a while. And This American Life is hosted by Ira Glass, and he was basically our editor. But in the time when I made that mistake, it was largely just Brian and I kind of consulting with each other. So it wasn't a thing that, for example, had the whole New York Times Serial kind of like team assembled, and I decided to go and do this thing without running it by them. It was, and it wasn't even supposed to be a thing. It was just supposed to be just like writing a letter to a source and seeing if they would speak to us. Now, what had happened is, like I think the day before or whatever, we'd called him, and he was he wasn't happy, and it was very aggressive, short phone call, and it just felt like it was clear that he wasn't going to speak to us without something major. But I just said to Brian, I'm going to write a letter to him, and he's the only one I ran it past. I didn't let him read the letter. I wrote it, I sent it, and he read it when the courts received it, I guess. So I would love to distribute the blame of that moment, but it's all me. And I didn't feel when Brian called me, you know, the only thing that was confusing to me in that conversation wasn't like him saying, "What have you done here?" Like that made sense to me, of course. I've messed up. It was the bit afterwards when he was like, "Do you believe this? Like, is this what you believe?" And that for me was a different question. Like I understood the tactical error. I understand what this means, but I wasn't sure why he was so confused about what I thought about what happened with the Trojan Horse. And that's where I started. If you listen to the conversation back, it's split into two parts. Part one is just me just in total shock and just apologetic and just kind of mumbling and totally confused. Then I go to drink some water, and there must be something in the water in Birmingham, because when I came back on the phone, I was just a lot more just like, yeah, okay, let's talk, and it was because I was just like, well, okay, yeah, like I had contextualized the mistake. Like I knew what I'd done, and for me, it was just like, okay, like it's a tactical error, which might be costly, but I didn't think it was beyond that. So when Brian kept pressing on, just like, do you believe this? That's where I got a bit annoyed. I got a bit confused. I was just like, yeah, I do. Like, if I didn't, why would I be doing this case? If I thought the official narrative of the Trojan Horse is real, why am I investigating it? Why am I spending all this time and resources on it? So the mistake was absolutely mine. And I think the only bit about Brian's phone call that I remember rubbed me up the wrong way was just him inquiring if I believed it.
I mean, Hamza, I'll just say that you might not know this because you haven't worked in a newsroom apart from this one, but traditionally the buck stops with the editor. You're not meant to, like, God bless you for shouldering all the blame, but it's meant to be a collaborative it is meant to be a collaborative process. Not even the best investigative journalist in the world works completely alone. So yeah, I hear you. And to an extent I agree with you, but and I don't know what happened behind closed doors and how much support you got behind closed doors, but I do hope that you got that support behind closed doors.
I mean, we made it as we made it a central tenet of the podcast. Like I think we're all as a team, me, myself,
and it was valuable, incredibly valuable. Yeah. We've got time for, I hope, just two more questions. The first is from Surah Muhammad, who says, thank you so much for the project. And she says, unlike other people, you actually interviewed the Muslim women and staff and students at the school, and you let them speak in their own words, in their own voices about their experiences. And throughout the Trojan Horse Affair, it's been clear that other people were speaking over them. Mm-hmm. Why do you think it took so long for this to happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that's a question that should be aimed at every other reporter in Britain. One of the most shocking responses we had was when Brian emailed this teacher at Parkview called Amina. And there was a lady at Parkview called Sue Packer who'd been for years sharing the same story about this incident that happened at the school that involved Amina. And the story, every reporter she'd met with, she'd kind of share this anecdote with, lawyers, legal proceedings, and not one person thought it fit to call Amina and contact Amina and verify the details of the story. And when Brian did, she emailed back saying it's the first she was hearing about this, which, I think that speaks to something. I even point to a lot of the criticism of the podcast or in general about, suppressing the voice or, like at least we spoke to Muslim women, you know what I mean? At least we went and did that. I can't speak to much of reporting in Britain that can kind of say the same, including the critics, like who did you go speak to at the school? Like it's hilarious, the projection that happens, because yeah, like you heard from Muslim women at Parkview School for the first time, and it was a complicated picture. It was a nuanced picture. You know, they didn't hold back about the criticism of the school, but it was helpful. It was helpful to hear, and I think a lot of reporters could have done that before, figured it out a bit more for themselves. Because that seemed to be the central tenet of the Trojan Horse, was like the Muslim women at the school, and go speak to them. Go speak to them. Let them tell you what happened.
We're running slightly over time now, but Rihanna, Parveen, and Ahmed both have, I think, an important question to end on. What do you think we as Muslims in Birmingham and the UK generally should do now to try to maintain pressure?
Yeah, I don't want to direct people's kind of outrage in that sense. Like, I think there's put it this way: if I was going to advise on one thing, maybe this is bad for me to say, and I'll probably get reprimanded for this, but like, I would encourage people to get off the Twitter spaces, because I've seen a bunch of Twitter spaces about the Trojan Horse. That's all I keep seeing is Twitter spaces, people talking about it. I would encourage people to consider actual things that you could do in response to it beyond just discussing it. There was an election that happened in May in Birmingham and elsewhere. That could have been an important point where Birmingham Muslims decided to put some pressure on the political leaders in the city to do something about the Trojan Horse. They chose not to, as far as I understand. You know, I think just follow-ups, like follow up with your political leaders, follow up with local reporters. Like, I think the reality is that, like, until the authority responds to this, there's not much you can do. So have a think about how you can get the authorities to respond to the report on the Trojan Horse.
Thank you. Hamza, thank you for your time. Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for creating a project that made the space for us to talk about the state of journalism and the concept of objectivity in 2022. I know that you've said to me offline that it feels like nothing came of this, but I think a lot has come of this, and we're very grateful to you, and I hope you continue.
I appreciate that.
I hope we haven't broken you.
Take care.
All right, Hamza, go well.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.